and welcome back to the channel. I'm Muriel, and in this video I will be reviewing the Harry Potter series written by, of course, J.K. Rowling. Like many, I first read the Harry Potter books as a child. Actually, the very first volume was read to me as a young child, since my dad bought it very shortly after it was first published in 1997. And the Potterverse was one of my earliest literary loves, or even special interests, I suppose, kind of, since I also watched and enjoyed all of the movie adaptations and, had Harry Potter themed things, played a lot of the video games, etc. So yes, Harry Potter was a big thing in my early life, up until around the age of 11, when I started to become more specifically obsessed with dragons and dragon-related literature. I read things like The Inheritance Cycle, The Earthsea Cycle, or some of the Dragon Riders of Pan books, then, progressively branched out more fully into science fiction and fantasy literature as a whole. Yay! Around age 12 or 13 was it, I read His Dark Materials and was really taken in by that story and its theming, which I found a lot more stimulating than anything I'd ever gotten out of Harry Potter. This means I was never really a Potterhead as such past actual childhood. I finished the series around the age of 15, I think, and whilst I was happy to finish it, I definitely didn't feel as strongly about it as when I'd started it, and probably felt like I'd, outgrown it, or rather, outpaced it in terms of depth of world-building and theming, two aspects of speculative storytelling I now value before any other. And I valued them before any other in general fiction as well, actually, but anyway. Still, I've always retained a fondness for that universe, which is why I decided to revisit it, fully expecting I wouldn't enjoy it as much as an adult and, much more experienced reader, which is exactly what happened. I did not enjoy the series as much as I did in the past, but it was still a positive experience overall, and I have a fair few thoughts about it, which I will now share with you. Although before I do that, a quick reminder that here is not the place to rant about or even really discuss J.K. Rowling as anything other than a writer. If you bring up the controversies that surround her or start going off about how she's the evilest woman on earth in the comments, you're allowed to believe that, but I don't want to hear about it here. I will remove those comments, you've been warned, because I do not care about this stuff in relation to her work of literature. I want to discuss the books here, not the human being behind them, or her presumed politics, beliefs, what have you. If you'd like more context for why that is exactly, I invite you to check out the video I made as an introduction to my channel, which goes into the nitty-gritty of my reading ethics and relationship to things like death of the author, and separating the art from the artist, and the art consumer. Thank you. Oh, and also, I'm absolutely not going to try and not spoil the plot of the series, because it's very old and, no. The Harry Potter series is written in third person, at times limited, at times more omniscient, and its main eponymous character, Harry Potter, is the more or less sole point of view you get in the story. I say more or less because there are a couple of opening chapters in the later books that present a different point of view in order, to my mind, set up the plot with a specific tone or, to introduce additional bits of world building or backstory. Also, tiny thing, but I really dig the named chapters formula. I don't need it in every book I read, but I do think it can be a neat little way to add flavor to your story. As to the quality of the prose itself, which I suck so hard at describing beyond the surface level, well, I thought it was good, smooth overall, not overly descriptive, at least in the earlier books. It felt more pragmatic than lyrical or inspiring as such, but it was clearly evocative enough to conjure up effective images of the wizarding world and its magic, although there was a clear increase of this as the books went on. The first 2 to 3 books don't actually have that many descriptions, and didn't feel that vivid on their own to my adult mind. And actually a funny thing happened because of that, but I'll come back to this in a bit. The writing style also has a somewhat simple but classic quality to it. I'd also apply it to His Dark Materials prose, and perhaps just other books I read as a child, so older children's literature, basically. The simple doesn't mean bad in this context, to be very clear. If anything, I'd argue I was kind of impressed by the quality and level of vocabulary employed in these books, given they were originally written for children, and then teenagers. Again, I can also say this of something like his Dark Materials, and not to throw shade or anything, but I go so far as to say these older children's books are, in my subjective opinion, better written, on the whole, than some of the YA literature I read as an older teenager or even young adult. Though I'll be the first to admit I haven't read that much YA literature either, so this is not me saying all of it is trash. I don't think that at all. I like the pacing of the series as a whole. Now, obviously, this varied from book to book, and I won't pretend there wasn't ever any bloat in the story. The addition of certain world-building elements or plot devices, like the Deathly Hallows, also affected the smoothness of the pacing in places, but overall, I didn't have any major complaints given how easily and quickly I was able to reread these books. Though I'll admit the audiobooks also certainly helped with that. I did a mix of text reading and listening to the audiobooks, narrated by the lovely Stephen Fry. No, they were great, honestly. I definitely think the fact most of these books were framed on a temporal level by the beginning and ending of a school year, more or less, right, given Harry's summer birthday was also always included, helped to keep the series pacing relatively even across all of its volumes. And this, despite the fact there's quite a drastic amount of variation in page count with these books as well. And by variation, I'm obviously referring to the fact the books drastically increase in size as the series goes on, or at least between books 1 and 5, since after that there's a slight decrease in page count. With this increase in page count also came an increase in plot and world-building complexity and maturity, which I both found really interesting to observe from like a craft standpoint and enjoyed. And which I needed, quite frankly, because those first couple of books especially were way too short, straightforward, and overtly meant for younger children for my tastes as an adult reader. This increase in page count wasn't always utilized perfectly, mind you, but it was also kind of neat to observe the maturation of the story and its characters. You can definitely count Harry Potter as a coming-of-age narrative, very literally, and Rowling's improvement as a writer, to some extent at least. She also, in my opinion, made good usage of the mystery plot formula overall, or, were applicable, though I guess ultimately there are mystery elements in all 7 volumes to greater or lesser extents. I found Harry Potter's character work pretty mixed overall. Some characters were obviously more fleshed out than others, and then most of the child characters became more fleshed out as they grew up with the books. A fair few of them were certainly memorable, even endearing at times, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't find the lack of psychological depth, in places at least, a little frustrating at times. I found this especially true of the story's baddies. Harry Potter does tend to go for a rather simplistic presentation of character motivations, or rather simplistic characterization when it comes to its baddies. Some characters do veer into cartoonishly evil territory, which I generally don't like. The main example of this that comes to mind is clearly Bellatrix Lestrange. Not Voldemort or Umbridge, though. The former does actually get a modicum of semi-nuanced backstory involving severe childhood neglect I could buy into, although this wasn't utilized nearly as much as I would have liked. The latter, for her part, just read to me as a kind of high-functioning sociopath, a kind of pathological personality I know does in fact exist in the real world, so she didn't trip my "this doesn't feel too realistic though" switch. It's not like she has layers upon layers to her personality either, right? But once I was able to fit her into a pre-existing personality template, if you will, I was more or less able to enjoy the role her evilness played in the story. In essence, she was a relatively simple, but sufficiently realistic and effective villain for me. The lack of psychological depth wasn't as big of a problem for the story's protagonists and neutral characters, though I stand by my opinion that Harry should have been a little more messed up than he actually was, bear with me, given the honestly kind of abusive upbringing he experienced with the Dursleys. Yes, he does receive love, friendship, warmth, community, etc. from age 11 onwards, and it's not like the Dursleys deprived him of food, clothing, or even schooling, basic necessities, but I mean, come on. He wasn't exactly treated well by them. His relatives never hid the fact they didn't love him, nor really want him around, and that should have had a much greater impact on his developing psyche than was shown in the story. But of course, most of my qualms with character work or world building, which will follow, come down to the fact this story is, First and foremost, one meant for children. And I guess you can't really go into the nitty-gritty of childhood CPTSD in a book meant for 7-year-olds and up. So fair enough. And it's not like Harry Potter doesn't feature any dark emotional content either, of course. There is, after all, plenty of grief stemming from the loss of loved ones in these books. I certainly think the book's child characters displayed very believable child and then teenage behaviors. In fact, I enjoyed a lot of the dialogues between teenage and adult characters because they felt very real and believable. The teenage romance elements, however, were unbearably cringe to me. And not particularly believable either, to be honest. So this was not just a I'm a demisexual person thing. Why Hermione and Ron actually came to fall in love with one another still remains a little unclear to me, though I guess it is true that a lot of people say sustained proximity breeds intimacy. So fine. But then you have the entirely incomprehensible, forced as fuck Harry-Ginny pairing. It didn't make a lick of sense to me as a teenager. It didn't make a lick of sense to me as an adult, so make of that what you will. It also felt a little weird to me how much Hermione and Ginny, was it just Hermione, whatever, were into Gilderoy Lockhart as 11 and 12-year-olds. Like, I don't know, it was weird, okay? I didn't really get it. I mean, I guess schoolgirl crushes on adults do happen. I should know, unfortunately. But the way it was actually articulated in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets was just a bit Mostly, I was more interested in the story's adult characters this time around. They were just way more engaging to suss out and follow for me as an adult reader, especially when backstory was given to flesh their personalities and motivations out. I'm especially thinking of Dumbledore, Snape, and Voldemort with this. I enjoyed McGonagall a lot more as well, and was surprised to realize she's actually a decent bit younger in the books than she was portrayed in the movies. Didn't remember that at all. As to favorite characters, Luna, yes, does remain a favorite, and she most definitely read as a bit different, or, you know, as neurodivergent coded to me. Especially, at least in contrast to the overwhelming majority of normie-feeling characters. Unfortunately, there isn't actually much of her in the story, so that was hashtag Big Satch for me. But then, I acquired a new favorite! Hagrid! My precious bestest boy! I loved him so much, just as we both love Fantastical Beasts. And, if you'll bear with me, I think you can also read him as being a little different. Either way, hashtag immeasurably based. Oh yes. I also loved Dobby, and was really sad when he was killed off. I was also sad when Hedwig was killed off. That was not okay! Like, what did that bird ever do to you? The fuck? I was mad again at both deaths, basically. I was just, no. Why? Honestly, I didn't actually care all that much about the book's actual protagonists. The triumphant trio, as I like to call them, of Harry, Ron, or even Hermione. Yes, she is wicked smart, and I could relate to that. But she was also rather conventional and feminine in a very, like, sorry, normie way. That's what I call it. And so in a way that left me completely indifferent to her, or largely indifferent to her. Yeah, I'll take Luna over Hermione any day of the fucking week. Ron was fine, though honestly I preferred his twin brothers, they were fun, or his parents. His dad especially was actually, I thought he was kind of cute with his, like, being a big nerd about muggles. I was like, aww. And then we have Harry. Harry is a fine kid. He has a good heart. He's a solid chap, right? But the whole chosen one shtick was annoying. Especially because that point, which had hitherto been established to be the result of a self-fulfilling prophecy, not anything inherent to him, and actually, I thought Rowling handled that prophecy thing pretty well. I found it decently clever, but so that was then kind of made irrelevant by some of the adults around Harry. Well, really, it was mostly Dumbledore. Just belaboring the point of him being this special, special boy. And I just didn't buy it. Especially when the Deathly Hallows were thrown into the mix. Oof. Dumbledore argued Harry is the perfect owner of all three Hallows, and I was like, is it though? Really? A teenage boy is the person best suited to owning three of the most powerful magical artifacts in the world. Really? Look, teenagers can be very sweet, good, compassionate, what have you people, right? Like, of course. It's not like we just become good people once we reach adulthood. But conversely, maturity of intellect and feeling, there is such a thing as emotional maturity as well. Those things should count for something, right? I mean, there's a reason we don't give nuclear launch codes to minors. Just saying. So yeah, I wasn't a fan of any of that. On to world building, and I'm going to start by getting my biggest issue with it right out of the way. I adore good world building, and I'm also what I like to call a nitpicky bitch. And the simple fact is Harry Potter's world building doesn't really hold up if you look at it from too distant a scope, looking for patterns that apply to the world at large, or from too near a scope, looking for a cohesive tapestry of finer details. There are many things that just do not make a lot of sense if you look at them too closely, like many things to do with magic in minors, or the fact Hogwarts has a house essentially meant for child bad guys. I mean, not entirely, technically, if you take the whole story into account, but still, that was very meh. Or if you try to extend the bounds of the wizarding world along temporal or geographical lines, though the latter gets a little better, a little more fleshed out with later books, but still, there are limits there. Another big one for me was also the complete lack of religion, faith, or any discussion of the ways magic could affect these two things. And, mind you, there is a similar issue with the world building in The Magicians by Lev Grossman, but I think it's ultimately handled better in those books, especially since the grey areas of the magic, etc. are also used to develop specific themes, in a way where it's just not the case with Harry Potter. So basically, Harry Potter's world building worked for me when I accepted the fact it works best at a sort of fuzzy middle distance of perception. And also I just had to make an effort to stop nitpicking, quite frankly, and just enjoy the ride I was actually given. Because said ride has a lot of charm to it, right? There is a lot of whimsy and endearing silliness in Harry Potter's world building, and the way it recycles all these different elements from chiefly European witch and supernatural folklore. And I'd contend it works best, it shines the most, when it leans into that whimsy and the earnest, free-spiritedness of its magic and magical world. Like, oh, you have to bow to hippogriffs to earn their respect. You get screaming letters from your parents when you fuck up. The way you deal with a boggart is by picturing it as something goofy. The Monster Book of Monsters is literally monstrous and will try to bite you. A lot of spells are just bits of repurposed Latin, and the Killing Curse is just a modified version of Abracadabra. Or just look at any of the exercises in Transfiguration class. They're all rather ridiculous. And it's not like any of the more serious or somber bits of world building don't ever work either. That's not what I'm saying. There are actually some decently clever bits of less silly magical world building that flavor the story as well. Like the fact, two of the things wizards study in the Department of Mysteries are love and time. I really like that. Or I mean, that idea. And there's like a bell jar that contains time in book 5, then a brain that has thought tentacles. That could have been written by China Miéville, honestly. There's also the pensive, which, honestly, I'd love to have one of those, wouldn't you? Etc, etc. Like I said earlier, these are books meant for children before anyone else, so obviously I wasn't going to get the deepest, most watertight world building ever, or, world building on deeper politics, religion, economics, and stuff like that. So yeah, I eventually put my nitpicking brain on standby, as it were, and did my best to enjoy the whimsy, the wonder, and of course, all the fantastical beasts, because mythology and mythological creatures are two of my oldest, most deeply rooted special interests. And then to reiterate, I think the fact Rowling took all these elements from chiefly European witch and supernatural folklore, shoved them in a mixer, and sprinkled in warm-hearted silliness and whimsy does give this series a semi-unique world-building flavor that does work overall to make it memorable and feel special, especially if you read these as a child. Though it's also true I was happier when the book started to increase in length and world-building and narrative complexity. There's nothing for it. Getting added depth and definition to the world-building will just, always be more enjoyable for me. And then a couple more specific things. Harry Potter's magic system. It's obviously very soft, right? This is not news to anyone. Pride of place is given to a sense of wonder, and then to whimsy, pleasurable silliness, especially when you look at spells or potions' names or their effects. though again, it was nice to see things taken from real-world folklore as well. That being said, the magic system, soft as it is, does have one hard rule, which I really appreciated. That is, of course, the fact people cannot come back from the dead. Not really. There is no true necromancy in this series. Yes, you can animate corpses, the Inferi. Yes, you can, under limited circumstances, talk to the dead, or at least memory imprints of the dead that were left behind. So, you know, ghosts, magical portraits, etc., and those are very rare, ultimately. And yes, you have the Resurrection Stone, but it's one object, also so just exceedingly rare, and it doesn't actually bring people back to life because nothing truly can. There is ultimately a finality to death, and several characters have to deal with the loss of loved ones, with deep grief, with being orphaned, etc., and learn to carry on with the memory and legacy of love instead. I really like that. And I just wanted to quickly touch upon the Horcruxes and Deathly Hallows. I think the addition of these elements just about worked. The Horcruxes especially felt mostly organically woven into the story, repurposing as they did previously featured magical objects. Though the way the story's overarching conflict between Voldy and Harry was ultimately resolved, you know, with him being the final Horcrux and that negating the killing curse, again, it just about worked given the explanation you receive in the text, but it's also not the smoothest thing in the world in terms of narrative resolution. The Deathly Hallows, for their part, also just about worked. But there again, it was a bit rough going in places. I don't think they were ultimately necessary to the story, and it really sat on that borderline of feeling like Rowling had bitten off more than she could chew in terms of narrative management. That being said, I really enjoyed the story within a story that was The Tale of the Three Brothers, so there's that. I don't think Harry Potter is the richest or deepest story in terms of theming. Shocking, right? Not. I'd qualify it as primarily entertainment and, let's say, emotional engagement driven, rather than ideas or greater spiritual edification driven. Children's fantasy as opposed, you know, to something like His Dark Materials, a story I find has much more engaging, stimulating, and memorable theming. And as a reminder, this is fine. I'm not saying one is objectively better or more valuable than the other. I don't believe in that. It's just that I personally prefer the latter kind of story to the former, especially, once again, if I'm going to read literature primarily meant for children or younger teenagers as an adult. That being said, there isn't nothing in terms of theming in Harry Potter either. There's obviously the fact the series, as I already mentioned, has a strong coming-of-age motif, right? Though, I don't know that it actually rises to the level of the theme as such, because I can't say I encountered particularly insightful commentary on the experience of childhood, teenagerhood, and the transition from both states to the beginnings of adulthood. Still, I wanted to acknowledge it again for completeness' sake. But then I can touch upon two through lines which I think do rise more properly to the level of themes. One is the idea that there is value and merit in fighting for what is right and what is fair, however scary, challenging, or difficult it may be, in the context of overarching systemic injustice. It's courage and the willingness to make sacrifices in the face of adversity, basically, with adversity here coming in the form of an authoritarian and hateful faction of wizards that hates muggles, wizards born of muggles, non-human magical peoples, etc. And of course you have that Dumbledore quote about choosing between what is right and what is easy. And honestly, it's a good quote, and I think it underscores a decently positive theme. It's not developed with the most depth, or nuance, or intricacy in the world. Well, yeah, because refer back to everything I already said, but I can respect it nonetheless. The second thematic through line I'd like to mention, and the one that came to me as an adult rereader as a very pleasant surprise, is that of the power, the magic, actually, of love. And friendship, loyalty, community, but really all of that can be subsumed under love in the broad sense. Love is just straight up referred to as the strongest, the most powerful, and ultimately mysterious kind of magic, by Dumbledore no less, in the story. Harry is safe from death by the love and love-driven sacrifice of his mother. That's very powerful. Characters fight evil because they love their friends, their family members, etc. There are several instances where parents specifically express deep concern and affection for their children. There's one scene where Molly breaks down in tears because she's terrified at the idea of her children being killed by Death Eaters. And I honestly found it pretty moving when I reread it, re-listened to it. Dobby helps Harry out of deep gratitude and genuine affection, and is then honored with a burial by some of the characters in Book 7. And that was just so sad. And actually, the last line of the chapter, during which he dies, is weirdly beautiful. Like, it really stood out to me. I actually wrote it down in my reading log. It was just like, oh, it's so sad, but it's written so prettily. Job well done there. Hagrid, my best boy, loves his magical creatures, #immeasurably based, and goes above and beyond to take care of them, even when everyone else thinks he's nuts for it, because, again, #immeasurably based. Dumbledore is shown to have been deeply impacted by the loss of a little sister he deeply loved, although that's a more minor element. He also comes to love Harry, obviously as a kind of surrogate child. Ron and Hermione accompany Harry on his quest to find Horcruxes as a matter of course, because they love him as a friend, and so on and so on and so forth. And I just kind of loved that myself, to be honest. Like, bar none, that was the most enjoyable element of the story I encountered as an adult reader. Because I guess the stuff didn't stick out to me nearly as much when I was a child than teenager. Now, have I seen deeper explorations of love and its consequences elsewhere? Of course, yes. Actually, a good example of this would be The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I did a review for it earlier this year if you'd like to check it out as an FYI. But, once again, I think, so love, this theme, and the way it's presented and developed, I think it's a pretty lovely, consistent theme for a series of children's books. So, yeah, point for that. Before I wrap up this review with my concluding remarks, I just wanted to briefly touch upon a few things some people have now, or I mean in recent years, deemed indicative of various problematic views, and give my own take on them. Because I really just wanted to respond to a few of these. Number 1, goblins equal anti-Semitism. Personally, I think seeing Harry Potter's goblins as substitute Jewish people says more about the reader than anyone else. Now sure, there is a discussion to be had about the sociological influences and associations Europeans may have projected onto various treasure-greedy, treasure-hoarding creatures of folklore such as knockers, goblins, hobgoblins, even dwarves, I guess, etc. But then, my take is, blame the collective unconscious of the Middle Ages and early modern period, you know, because for my part, I don't think one singular author, or even several authors, but just, you know, private individuals writing fiction, mining European folklore, you know, established European folklore, to get fun critters out of it is particularly guilty of anything. Especially since Harry Potter's goblins didn't read as Jewish to me. They read as goblins! Sure, though, I'll admit, I think the movies made that bit a bit more sus. So I'll give the folks who think there's stuff that, but no more. I'm sorry, the goblins in the books are just goblins. 2. Umbridge was raped by the centaurs, you know, who carted her off in the Forbidden Forest, because they are centaurs. Sure, if you believe that every single representation of a mythological creature is a literal copy-paste of their representation in ancient cultures, I'm going to remain civil and polite here and simply say that you're free to do whatever, but I personally don't operate that way. Also, centaurs, as understood by the ancient Greeks, would have to be portrayed as brutish savages, not wise astrologers like they are in Harry Potter. Y'all know that, right? Those are based on basically one, maybe a couple at most, at least based on my knowledge of Greek mythology, wise centaur character. And that would basically be Chiron, right? So, like, sure, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'm not sure how that applies to literature, though. So if you really want to headcanon Umbridge being gang raped by the centaurs of the Forbidden Forest in a children's book, go right ahead, I guess. Because, you know, we're all free to read things as we like. I do believe in that. But again, ultimately, that says more about you as a reader than anything else. 3. Snape, a character who turns out to have been a hero, is that even the right word? Sort of, I guess, whatever, is actually an incel. I don't even know how seriously some people take this. I've definitely seen it spelled out that way. Now, I think that's only true if you think all virgins are incels by default. Do we even know that he was a virgin when he died? Like, I mean, there's a lot of inference going on in these things. So, I guess this is true if you think all virgins are incels by default, which honestly, sorry, not sorry, I think that's incredibly offensive to virgins who don't have vitriolically misogynistic views. And yeah, I just don't use the label incel that way at all. In fact, I'm against using the label of incel to refer to anyone who doesn't endorse manosphere bullshit. So I'll agree, yes, that Snape was largely a piece of shit. I mean, he was a massive asshole, right? And rather pathetic. Sure. Though, he did the right thing in the end, and I do believe there is something to be said for that. But no, I don't see any evidence in text that he was an incel in any meaningful sense of the concept, and also I'm pretty sure the concept, label, word, what have you, of incel didn't even exist when the Harry Potter books were published. So someone can fact check the timeline on that one for me if they want, but so yeah. And finally, 4, house elves mean the books endorse slavery. I agree that there is clumsiness, yes, in terms of world building where the house elves are concerned. That being said, I think the house elves probably simply pulled from hell of fairy creature folklore, you know, brownies and the like, and I don't see an inherent problem with that. B, there are several characters in the story who object to the condition of house elves, very prominently including Hermione and freaking Dumbledore. You know, the good old wise guy, right? Hell, he even argues that wizards kinda had it coming with the Death Eaters and all that shit, given how shit they had been to non-wizards and sentient magical beings. It's like, oh, y'all have been like discriminatory pieces of shit, well, that shit's gonna happen. Yay. And C, yes, the thing with Winky. Winky was so cute though. She was tragically cute. Anyway, yes, Winky doesn't deal well with freedom. At all. You know, she drinks herself into a stupor. It's very sad. And that's seen by some as proof that slavery is seen as a good thing in the books. Again, I'm going to remain polite here and simply say that that is one hell of a leap in logic, and also the simple fact is that depiction is not necessarily unrealistic. The tragic fact is that kind of reaction exists today, not with house elves, obviously they don't exist, but you know, with abusive relationships. And that kind of reaction most certainly has existed in the past, or actually still in the context of the present, sadly, in the context of slavery.
And actually, screw it, I did want to add a little note about this because it just occurred to me, the more I think about it, the more Winky actually straight up reminds me of a battered woman who left her abusive partner, husband, what have you, ironically a bit too soon and just doesn't know how to cope with that. If anything, the reaction makes me think of that way more, and then I kind of wonder if, again, I don't really want to speculate about personal things because it shouldn't really matter at the end of the day, but I do believe Rowling had experience being an abused woman. So if anything, it feels like it's more in that domain of experiences. It still feels a bit weird and a bit too, like, real with a capital R for a children's book. I still think its insertion is kind of clumsy and it feels like it doesn't quite fit. But that's what it makes me think of. And so, again, that is 1,000,000,000% unfortunately something that happens.
Just please look this stuff up in historical nonfiction material, or better yet, because we're talking about fiction, and SFF fiction specifically, please pick up 4 Ways to Forgiveness by the great Ursula K. Le Guin, or something like Kindred or Xenogenesis by the great Octavia E. Butler, and you'll see what I mean with this. So sure, again, it is clumsy and kind of out of place. But is it proof that the books, and then the author, but we're not going to go there, are pro-slavery? Hell to the fuck no, in my book. Sorry, not sorry. My rereading of the Harry Potter series basically went down exactly as I expected it would. It was very pleasant overall and relaxing. I enjoyed myself. But I also most definitely enjoyed it a lot more as a much younger reader. I was very pleasantly surprised by that theming on love, like I said, and love spending time with my bestest boy Hagrid and my bestest girl Luna, though not nearly enough of it, and all the magical critters. But if push came to shove, I would still say I prefer his Dark Materials, written by Philip Pullman, as a better rounded work of children's fiction, because I think its world building and theming are, on the whole, superior, and that's what I prefer. Although that work is not without its flaws either. Actually, I did a series review of his Dark Materials a few years ago, if you'd like to check that out. It didn't help that the first 2 or 3 books really felt like children's books. And also, here's the interesting bit I said I would come back to earlier. When I reread books 1 and 2, specifically, I basically saw the movie adaptations unfold in my head as I was reading or listening to the audiobooks. I must have watched and rewatched them so much as a kid, and they're such faithful adaptations, that my brain was, I guess, incapable of generating its own idiosyncratic imagery while I was reading. And it's not like I've never had anything similar happen with other books. Things like even The Song of Ice and Fire, given I watched season 1 of the show first. But this was just overwhelming. Like, there was nothing of my own because there was nothing new to create in my head. I was just watching the movies in my head as I was reading. It was wild. Because, like, those first 2 books are very short, very straightforward in their plotting. And yeah, their movie counterparts are extremely close to being one-to-one adaptations. So, if anything, I was a little bored at times because I didn't really have anything to rediscover in. And so, yeah, literally reimagine from them. But then, thankfully, things got a little bit better in book 3 and significantly better and more interesting from book 4 onwards. And yeah, just like I did as a teenager, I much preferred the later Harry Potter books overall. They're definitely more complex, have more world building, become progressively more mature, and a little darker. But yeah, that's just a lot more my jam as an adult reader. Still, there is something to be said for that whimsy and that charm. There is something very charming about Harry Potter and its magical wizarding world, and Hogwarts itself, of course. I'm like, I love the game Hogwarts Legacy. It wasn't the best game ever, but it was a very enjoyable game. It was such a pleasure to explore Hogwarts the way they created it in that game. It was just lovely. And also, I realized that the one other work of literature I feel achieves this specific flavor or tone of fantasy with whimsy taking place in our world and very British is Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Don't get me wrong, there are obviously many differences between the 2 works, right? But I feel they also kind of form a natural pairing. Though obviously I wouldn't give the latter to young children, it's very much meant for adults. But I'm also saying this because some people compare Harry Potter to Earthsea and its School of Magic on Rogue, or The Magicians and its Breakbills, most often in order to disparage Harry Potter, I might add. But that's only relevant, in my opinion, if you limit yourself to a rather surface-level appreciation and analysis of stories and their elements. Because the magic school is just one element in the tapestries of all these stories. Now, okay, sure, it is a major one in Harry Potter, but you have to look at the rest of it too. If anything, I'd say the Kingkiller Chronicles is the more recent work that pairs and converses best with Earthsea and its magic, and its School of Magic at any rate. And even then, there are a lot of differences between the 2, of course. And then when it comes to the Magicians, the far more relevant, older work to bring up in conversation is clearly the Chronicles of Narnia. Harry Potter is not completely irrelevant, but the one that is way more relevant is the Chronicles of Narnia, just straight up. So yeah, for Harry Potter, I would say it's actually Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So there you go. All in all, this was, like I said, a very pleasant rereading experience. Whatever else she may be as a person, and we're not going to go there, I do think J.K. Rowling wrote and told a good, not great, but solidly good, enjoyable, memorable, and clearly impactful, right? For many, myself included, story in the pages of the Harry Potter series. If I had to slap a rating on it, for what it is, so a series primarily meant for children and then teenagers, I'd probably go with something between a 7 and a very soft 7.5 out of 10, depending on the book, etc. I wouldn't recommend it to adult readers. at all, personally. Unless said adult readers enjoy reading children's books specifically, of course. But I definitely think these are absolutely still worth reading to, or with one's children, or with giving to one's children, obviously. Harry Potter played an ultimately short-lived, but still meaningful role in my development as a reader. I don't know that I will ever read this series again, but yes, it and its magical wizarding world and its fantastical beast as well will most definitely retain a special place in my heart. And that will conclude my review of the Harry Potter series written by J.K. Rowling. I hope you found this review entertaining, interesting, engaging, all, or any of the good things. If you'd like to share thoughts, feelings about the Harry Potter books, you're welcome to do so in the comments down below. And on that final note, I wish you all a lovely day, evening, whichever time of day you prefer. Please do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all at some point in another video. But until then, bye-bye.